So good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure truly to welcome everyone to this second webinar series of Medanta Echo on Cardiology today and tomorrow. And it's kind of sad because, in April every year we used to have a good meeting. Everybody used to come. It was also a question of bonhomie and meeting everyone. But, well, the circumstances as they are. Now, coming to hypertension, we selected today two topics which I think are not spoken so well, are not so well understood, so that those we will speak on, particularly cognitive disorders and managing hypertension. But it's also my privilege truly to welcome Dr. Professor Vijay Raghavan. Dr. Raghavan and I, we have traveled together for almost 35 years in our lives, and at every major meeting we've met each other. I have great respect for him. And I've known him since the days echo was actually in the stage of M-mode echocardiography. And he first demonstrated flutter of the tricuspid valve in patients of EMF. So my association goes that far back. And of course, Dr. Pandey Chandrasekhar has been a guiding force for us and has been talking to our department. And it's really a pleasure to have both of you. So now I will hand over the mic to you, Dr. Vijay Raghavan. You are the chairman, and it's all yours. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ravi, for the nice introduction. And I always enjoy the hospitality of Medanta, especially Ravi Kasliwal, and this time it's only virtual hospitality. Still, I love it. And the subject today, as you may find, is the systemic hypertension. Please understand, systemic hypertension is a new disease of the 20th century. It is not mentioned in any of the ancient textbooks. Charaka Samhita has no descriptions or vague symptoms of some of the phenomena of blood pressure, but they have no method of measuring blood pressure. Thickening of the left ventricle without disease of the valves have been described by many workers, including Leonardo da Vinci. The methods of checking blood pressure from 19th century onwards was all centered on checking the systolic blood pressure. The famous sphygmomanometer of Riverace also measured only the systolic blood pressure, and various modifications of Riverace's blood pressure apparatus came in, but still it was only systolic blood pressure. The Korotkov thesis was neglected for a long time, until it was made to resurface. People never realized that his contribution has been so substantial. And he only described systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, mean arterial blood pressure. Discovery made all the difference to the measurement of blood pressure during life, and systemic hypertension became a disease to be reckoned with. Many thought this is an aging phenomenon and a compensatory phenomenon to improve tissue perfusion. By about 1918, insurance companies were measuring systolic and diastolic blood pressures by auscultation under somewhat standardized conditions, rather than simply systolic blood pressure by palpation. But look at what happened to President Roosevelt of USA, who was president for three sittings. At the age of 53 years, he became the president for the first time. BP was 140/80. By 1940, blood pressure rose to 180 by 105 with cardiomegaly, and he had a stroke with hemiplegia. With hemiplegia, he became president again. By 1944, blood pressure went up to 230, 120. Still, his cardiologist, Paul Dudley White, said, this is not something to be tampered with. This rise of blood pressure is to push blood into tissues, and this is a compensatory phenomenon. But over a period of time, renal failure set in, cardiac failure set in, and at the age of 63, we lost Roosevelt because cerebral hemorrhage with a blood pressure of 230 by 120. 1949, after years of scrupulous collation of analysis of data, it was Rustam Jal Vakil, Bombay, published a watershed paper on the antihypertensive properties of Rauwolfia serpentina and effected a paradigm shift in the management of hypertension. Rauwolfia was the world's first successful blood pressure lowering agent, and its acceptance encouraged research scientists to pursue the development of other hypertensive drugs. Padma Bhushan, Rustam Jal Vakil, and the Rauwolfia serpentina. Sphygmomanometer electrocardiogram. Look at the electrocardiogram which became popular by 1920. Still, the sphygmomanometer was not part of the physician's kit. Only or 1950s we realized the havocs of systemic hypertension. The tragic complications of President Roosevelt probably played a part in highlighting the importance of controlling systemic blood pressure, and Joint National Council was born still late. Of late, you must have understood demise of the mercury blood pressure apparatus, primarily on mercury-related health concerns, which many in the field vigorously debated. Mercury manometer has essentially been replaced with aneroid electronic devices, which requires frequent standardization. So this is the story of blood pressure, and it's a new disease that we had to reckon with. And please, I would like to invite Dr. Pandey to deal with resistant hypertension, difficult to control hypertension. Dr. Pandey, please.
Thank you, sir. Can I share my slides? Can you see the slides, sir?
Yeah, we can see the slides.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Kasliwal, for inviting me here. And as, he has been kind enough to invite me for every Medanta program. And this is probably the year where it could not be done because of the pandemic. And here I am. And he told me that I want you to talk on what we call as uncontrolled hypertension. He was very specific that I should be speaking on uncontrolled hypertension. So let us start with this. And as Dr. Vijay Raghavan has said, since the inception of this sphygmomanometer way back around more than a century ago, we all started measuring blood pressure, but we are still far, far away from getting our patients' blood pressures controlled very well. So in this talk, my goal is to create a therapy of ideas, to try to bring the new ideas so that we can see the same old problems a little in a different manner. I'm not here to talk a theoretical jargon of number of drugs and things like that, but a therapy of ideas. So when we talk about essential hypertension, uncontrolled hypertension is a term which is used whenever the blood pressure is more than 140/90. This is simply called uncontrolled hypertension. So many of these people may not be treated. Some of these people may not be even aware, and some of these people may be treated, but yet not controlled. So this is all a full gamut of uncontrolled blood pressure. Of course, there are some other terms called resistant, refractory, malignant, etc. And we all know them. We are here about them, and we'll discuss them at the end of this topic in a slide or two. So this is the uncontrolled hypertension. So look at this is the magnitude of 2005 paper in Circulation by the Hamida et al. Had shown that hypertension affects around 30 million people, 67 million people in the United States, around 30% of people, and out of them 53, that is around 35.8 million, are uncontrolled. That means their blood pressure is not controlled. And out of these which are uncontrolled, some of them are not even aware that they have blood pressure. Some of them are aware but untreated, and some of them are aware and treated and yet uncontrolled. So you can imagine the burden of uncontrolled hypertension is far much more gross than the small minuscule tip of the iceberg called resistant hypertension. And these two articles will be the eye-opener articles about beliefs about hypertension among people with uncontrolled hypertension. These beliefs are very, very interesting, very queer beliefs. Why control of hypertension is important? Because there is an increasing cardiovascular risk above 115 millimeters of mercury. 35% of heart cardiovascular deaths, 50% of stroke, and 25% of coronary artery diseases, and around 50% of congestive heart failure are all contributed primarily because of uncontrolled blood pressure. In India, around quarter of men and around 20% of women above the age of 25 suffer from hypertension. A little lesser than global average, but slowly we are catching up because urbanization is increasing, lifestyle is changing, salt intake is increasing, and therefore we will have a high burden of hypertension in years to come. In India, hypertension is directly responsible for around 60% of stroke deaths, 60% of CKD. That is Georgia Abrams study last year published in the Journal of Nephrology, and 25% of all coronary artery disease deaths are clearly because of hypertension. So when you have a incremental risk factor which contributes that, but the worst problem is, out of the 30% hypertensives in India, 1/3 are diagnosed. Out of those who are diagnosed, approximately 1/3 are treated. Out of those who are treated, almost 1/3 are controlled. So 70% of the people with hypertension are uncontrolled blood pressure, which is very, very disappointing. And there are confounders. When you say hypertension and uncontrolled hypertension, there are confounders. One confounder is white coat hypertension. The studies indicate that significant white coat is present in people with hypertension with a prevalence of around 20 to 30%. And white coat may be labeled as uncontrolled. That is why this is one confounder. But please remember, white coat hypertension does not have a benign prognosis. Its prognosis is worse than that of normotension and little better than that of masked hypertension. Then there is something called pseudo resistance, that measuring the blood pressure before letting the patient sit quietly, using too small a cuff, poorly or never calibrated BP instruments, worn off balloon cuffs, and poor reluctance or reluctance to use ABPM and HBPN will land up in what we call pseudo resistance. Meaning what? You will land up in telling the patient that you are not controlled, but actually the patient is controlled because you are not measured the office blood pressure correctly. And back to the school again, how the blood pressure should be taken. ACCHA recommendation: one sitting and one standing, 2 readings 5 minutes apart, after a quiet period of at least 20 minutes of resting. Korotkov 5 sounds used for disappearance. A standard cup size should be used. Instrument should be calibrated. The cup should encircle 80% of the arm. It should be quiet environment. Relaxed doctor and relaxed patient. Patient should not have smoked, had alcohol or coffee within 4 hours of the taking blood pressure measurement, and with a cue to the auscultatory gap. Now, all these requirements you can imagine. So the first question is, when you label somebody as uncontrolled hypertension, did I measure the blood pressure correctly? And Norman Kaplan has said, the measurement of blood pressure is the clinical procedure of greatest importance, but performed in the most sloppiest manner in everyday clinical practice. And this is a fact of life. We are becoming busier and busier people, and we don't have time to spend with the people even to take one blood pressure measurement correctly and quietly. Therefore came the home blood pressure monitor. In home blood pressure monitor, patient is relaxed in his home atmosphere. So you have to make the patient perform blood pressure measurement in minimum 3 consecutive days. On each day, 3 mornings and 3 evening readings, 1 minute apart. So there are some blood pressure machines, HBPM machines, which when we take it on, you take 3 readings consecutively and they're average. Have the patient record dates and timings of all measurements. When calculating the average, discard the first reading and average the remaining of the measurements. This is JAMA, and proudly I'm telling you, the India Heart study, which we just published in the Journal of Clinical Hypertension last year, which was done under the leadership of Dr. Upendra Kaul and sponsored by Ares Pharma, we measured 18,000 patients in more than 360 cities in India, 2-tier and 3-tier cities, and we used this equipment called the MicroLife, which measures three readings and averages them. This one study which was done recently showed that if you diagnose by office BP 831 patients, are labeled them as normotensives and hypertensives. These normotensives you subject to home BP, more than half of them turn out to be a true normotension, whereas around 1/3 turn out to have masked hypertension. When in office BP you label somebody as hypertensive and subject them to home, Some of them turn out to be a small percentage, 20% turn out to be a white coat, and remaining turn out to have sustained hypertension. So it is extremely important that HBPM reclassifies office BP measurements and has a better prognostic value. Over and above that, we have need for ABPM also in select group of patients. 50% of controlled hypertension have uncontrolled morning blood pressure. 2/3 of CKD patients have non-dipping night blood pressure patterns, either reverse dipping or non-dipping. Then 32% hypertensive subjects have white coat hypertension. 60% of sleep apnea patients purely have nocturnal hypertension. And how the hell you will diagnose that without doing ABPM? It is impossible. 13% of people have masked hypertension. That means normal blood pressure at office, but high blood pressure at home. And what are the markers? Unexplained LVH, unexplained rise in uric acid, unexplained marginal increase in creatinine, unexplained microalbuminuria in a patient who is normotensive in your office. Suspect masked hypertension. Subject them to HBPM, subject them to ABPM, and you will be surprised that you have detected a masked hypertension. So next question is, have I used HBPM and ABPM in select group of patients in my practice? That is the next question the clinician has to ask himself. And of course, there are ESC and ESH definitions of HBPM and ABPM mean values. The simple definition is for office BPs less than 140/90 is controlled, above 140/90 is uncontrolled. Whereas for the home BP mean is 130/85. Ambulatory BP mean is also 130/85. And the night mean is 120/70. So this is the India Heart Study which we did in 19,000 patients, 1,233 investigators. Out of that, proudly I'm telling you, 320 investigators were under my bannership, 15 states, 355 cities, and Maharashtra contributed 11% of those patients. And the conclusions were, we in India, Indian hypertensive is a sympathetically driven hypertensive. They have higher resting heart rates than Caucasians or blacks. We have higher prevalence of white coat, 23%, higher prevalence of masked, 21% than the Western or Caucasians. And oscillometer-based HBPM is a preferred method of BP reading in India, where we are still using, 70% of us are still using mercury, which is never ever calibrated for years together, lying in our office with balloon cups, leaking mercury, and we are giving blood pressure measurements on that. And that's a sorry state of affairs. So again, going back, if your office BP more than 130/80, you do a home BP monitoring. If home is more than 135/85, it is uncontrolled hypertension. As against, suppose you don't want to do HBPM, patient is not that literate, you do ABPM. And if ABPM mean is more than 130/80, you are landing up in uncontrolled hypertension and you need intensification of antihypertensive medication. And this is a beautiful diagram from Zivans et al. In JACC last year. You know, this doctor, I'm so thankful to Dr. Kasliwal to title this as uncontrolled, because look at this, the base of the pyramid here is uncontrolled. And on the left hand side is controlled. So when I use lifestyle modification on just one blood pressure measurement, one or two BP medicines, you can have a controlled or uncontrolled BP. With one or two medicines, if it is uncontrolled, it is uncontrolled. With 3 or 4, if it is uncontrolled, that is called resistant. With 5 or more, it is uncontrolled, it is called refractory. Whereas with 3 or more, when it is resistant, and you land up in doing some tricks of the trade and get them controlled, it is controlled but resistant hypertension. And number of medications just keep on increasing as you go above. So what are the factors leading to uncontrolled hypertension? Let us talk about patient-related factors. One is beliefs and prejudices, non-compliance to medications, and non-compliance to lifestyle modifications, non-adherence to medications, and some other drugs because of comorbid conditions. True resistant and refractory are a very small percentage of uncontrolled patients, maybe less than 5%, depending on the population that you study. This is another lovely slide that I love from, again, one of my mentors in my Brisbane Heart Institute in Prince Charles Heart Institute in Brisbane, Dr. Martin Masterson, and a authority in world hypertension. He said knowledge is definition of hypertension, that uncontrolled BP can cause MI, stroke, etc. But look at the beliefs. Hypertension always causes symptoms, and meds should be avoided when there are no symptoms. You treat BP only when there are symptoms. That's a belief. Another belief, I have hypertension, but I don't think I have a heart attack or a stroke. Medicines are needed, lifestyle is needed, but heart failure often has no symptoms. Some causes may be modifiable. And the cross section of all this, it points to only one cross section. If patient believes that if with higher blood pressure I am at risk, he will do everything that you advise him. So you have to zero in on this factor, that tell him that you are at risk. So the best proven non-pharmacological strategies are weight loss. There is a background noise, something at least. DASH diet, dietary sodium restriction, aerobic physical activity, and quitting alcohol. And how much that this contribute? Healthy lifestyle contributes phenomenally to the control of blood pressure. So have I given the adequate lifestyle advice? If I don't have a time, have I recruited someone to give that adequate lifestyle advice is the next. And look at this. Weight reduction, 5 to 10 millimeters of fall. Diet, 8 to 14 millimeters of fall. That is just a rich fiber diet with high in potassium. Reduce salt to add to this diet, another 2 to 8 millimeter reduction. Physical activity, around 10 millimeter reduction. And alcohol moderation, 2 to 4 millimeter reduction. Keep on adding this and you will require possibly the least amount of drugs if you follow your lifestyle very well. Most of the patients don't do this, and then they compare their blood pressure control versus what has been controlled in clinical trials, where those people are rigorously controlled lifestyle modification. Obesity, by virtue of strong association with OSA, high sympathetic activity, high sodium overload, and insulin resistance, contributes to blood pressure. And every 10 kg of weight loss reduces systolic blood pressure by 10 millimeters of mercury and diastolic by around 6 millimeters of mercury. People should know that. Non-adherence, non-compliance is another big problem in all the countries. No country is exception. Whether it is a developed country, developing country, no country is exception. And the common causes of this are side effects of the drugs, cost of the drugs, infrequent use of fixed drug combinations. Single pill combinations is the way to go today. Complexity of regimen, multiple medications for multiple other comorbidities, lack of understanding of gravity of the disease, false belief that my hypertension has got cured now, and patients with cognitive dysfunction, which Dr. Kasniwar is going to talk to us and enlighten us how that affects the adherence. So next is, have I checked compliance and drug interactions? Now, adherence can be checked by the patient's self-report of pill count, which is a poor way. The best way is measuring drug levels, but which is costly and not practical. The best way is to keep a pill count and tell the patient to give your secretary or your assistant a pill count at the end of his next visit. So the adherence factor, if you have prescription refill, 31% accurate, drug level 86% accurate, pill count only 3% accurate. Pill count can be manipulated, And then drug related causes, so many drugs, including NSAIDs, COX-2 inhibitors, sympathomimetic agents, stimulant drugs, alcohol, oral contraceptive, erythropoietin, herbal compounds used for various purposes, including hair growth and things like that. They all cause adverse rise in blood pressure. And you should be proactive, and your assistant should be proactive in asking the patient that whether he's consuming any of these drugs for his comorbidities or for his cosmetic indications. And identification of evaluation of risk factors. Other than that, there are certain risk factors in a patient, and these are: older the age, difficult to control blood pressure; higher baseline blood pressure at the time of diagnosis, 180, 110. Mark you'll require 3 or more drugs. Obesity, definitely difficult to control. OSA, unless it is titrated with a good CPAP or a BiPAP machine, difficult to control blood pressure. Unless the patient gives up excessive salt intake, difficult to control. CKD, all of us will vouch by it. CKD patients will require average 4 drugs, and despite that, the blood pressure remains uncontrolled. So black race and female gender are another 2 background factors in a patient which make the blood pressure difficult to control. OSA is a definitely missed common risk factor for uncontrolled hypertension. So if you find a short, dwarf patient, ask the spouse whether he snores excessively in the night, whether there are apneic episodes, apneic sounding episodes in the night, and you will be surprised that you may pick up almost 20% of uncontrolled hypertensives to be having obstructive sleep apnea. In one of my pivotal papers, which I published 6 years ago, in 5 physicians and 6 cardiologists from our hospital, our OSA in patients with difficult to control blood pressure, not resistant, difficult to control blood pressure, was to the tune of 16%. The factors leading to uncontrolled hypertension. Look at this physician. These are very interesting. They're very, very interesting. Lack of awareness about latest guidelines. Personal whims and prejudices about the target BP in different population. Dr. Kasniwal was telling me that day. Some GPs tell the patient, "Are you are 60, no? So for you, 160/90 is normal blood pressure. Don't go below that." That is wrong. Very poor use of HBPM and ABPM. Inadequate time spent in the first visit. Poor advice about lifestyle modification. Infrequent use of single pill combination. Single pill combinations improves compliance. So these are two beautiful papers again. Physician related barriers to the effective management of uncontrolled hypertension. Lovely paper to read by Oliveira, and she has clearly pointed out that in her study, in this article, 70% of the time it was physician related factor which was responsible for uncontrolled BP rather than it was for the patient. Can you imagine? Patient was all right. He was taking medicines all right. But the physician had prejudices. He was not well versed about the guidelines. And the same thing has come in Indian practices as well. So you should know about the guidelines, whether it is IHS or ACC. Little bit differences may be there about what is stage 1 and what is stage 2, but you should be aware of them. You should be well versed with them. And you should be telling yourself that, am I dealing with a group A patient who has no risk factors, no target organ damage, no cardiovascular disease? Group A. Whatever the level of BP is. I'll give you an example. If I have 2 patients in my clinic, 150/90 BP, right? Forget the stages, maybe stage 1. But group 1 person has no cardiovascular risk factors, no diabetes, no target organ damage, no smoking, no dyslipidemia. Second patient has creatinine of 1.4, microalbumin of 600 milligrams per 24 hours in urine. He is a smoker and has family history of premature coronary artery disease. And his CT calcium score is 600. He becomes in group C. Most aggressive control of blood pressure is required for the same level of blood pressure at the time of diagnosis. So you have to separate the blood pressure patient into group A, group B, and group C as per the ESC. So do I know the latest guidelines? That's the next question the clinician should ask himself. And the guidelines say they support ABPM for diagnosis of mast and white coat, diagnosis of nocturnal dipping patterns, and diagnosis of early morning surge in a suspected patient. Also, the ABPM gives you a beautiful way. Look at this. The green arrow is concordance between ABP and office. So office and ABPM, both are below 140/90, good control. Both are above 140/90, concordant discontrol. Here, office is high, but ABPM is low, white coat. Office is low, ABPM is high, mast. So it is as simple as that. So you know that from the ABPM. So this is our own paper. And I remember when Jagdish and Manoj and Dr. Upendra Kaul started this project, I thought doing 23,000 patients with ABPM in this country will be virtually impossible. But sooner or later we landed there, and the data was so very eye-opener. So I can tell you that ESH and ESC office cutoffs of BP, you should keep in your clinic to know in which category of patient, what is your target BP. So 2 figures you should remember: uncomplicated hypertension 140/90, complicated hypertension 130/80. Combination therapy is a practical necessity today. We know that combinations achieve earlier blood pressure to target levels, higher response rate, and they are required in almost 75% of hypertensives today. There is a rationale there because blood pressure is sustained by many different mechanisms. And if you target one mechanism, the second factor becomes active. I will give a beautiful example. So do I know the need for rationale for single pill combinations? This is a patient 1. This blue square is a RAS. This is a patient of renovascular hypertension with grossly activated RAS, modestly activated sympathetic system, very less volume overload. In the middle, I have a metabolic syndrome patient with lot of volume overload, minimally activated RAS, and modestly activated sympathetic system. On the right hand side, I have a young, ambitious, type A personality globetrotter with very high sympathetic surge, very modest activation of RAS and very minimal volume overload. Suppose I start treating this middle patient with a diuretic because it is volume overload. After 3 months, the plasma volume contracts and there is a secondary activation of the RAS. The blue square now becomes dominant and the blood pressure then starts creeping up again. This is the type of patient who will require a RAS blocker and a CHIP diuretic combination right at the word go. So, if you see all the trials, from UKPDS to renal, IDNT, ALAT asked 2/3 of patients have required 3 or more drugs to control their blood pressure. And this is Neil Poulter's original paper, Combination Therapy in the Management of Hypertension, which one for which patient. 2013 guidelines changed. They said whenever possible, use of fixed drug combination should be preferred. And which combinations are the best? Angiotensin receptor blocker with a diuretic, best combination. Calcium blocker with a diuretic. So all the blue lines are approved combination. Calcium blocker with a beta blocker. Calcium blocker with an ACE inhibitor. These are the approved or fairly established combinations. So 2018 ESC/ESH guidelines say that initial therapy should be a single pill with ACE/ARB plus CCB or a diuretic. So my first choice is always ACE/ARB with a CHIP diuretic. No response, add calcium channel blocker in the step 2 as a single pill to improve compliance. So single pill combination is the buzzword in the world of hypertension today. And the combinations which are tested in several trials are these: Progress, Advance, and HUED check ACE with diuretic, ARB with diuretic in SCOPE, calcium blocker with a diuretic in FEVER, ACE and CCB in CIST Europe and CIST China, and so on. So many combinations have proved reduction of cardiovascular events in 3 to 6 years of follow-up. And some of them, like an ACE plus a CHIP diuretic like indapamide, has shown a legacy effect even after stopping the drug. What is chronobiology of hypertension? Instead, just 1 minute in this Hamida's original paper in Hypertension in 2017. She showed that 1300 true resistant hypertension, when used a single drug at bedtime, led to better control of blood pressure. So her next paper appeared when that this was original work of Diana, large number of patients contributed by her. She said, if you have to give a single drug, single pill, give it at bedtime. By bedtime administration of a single pill, you reduce cardiovascular events by 61% against the same pill being given at the breakfast time. So you must know that chronobiology of hypertension states that if you are using 2 different pills, one should be in the morning and ACE with a CHIP diuretic should be in the night. Calcium with beta blocker, preferably in the morning. If you have beta blocker alone, preferably in the morning. And if you don't have that, if you have got a single pill with 2 drugs, give it at evening time. That improves compliance, reduces nocturnal rise or nocturnal non-dipping, and improves cardiovascular events. So the nice pathway when you are not controlled with a combination of ACE/ARB, calcium blocker, and diuretic. Measure serum potassium. Less than 0.4, add a mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist. If it is more than 4.5, double the dose of CHIP diuretic. And then go on as per this flow chart. And you will land up in majority of them controlled very well by just shifting from CHIP diuretic, addition of mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist. If that is not the case, substituting CHIP diuretic with a loop diuretic, and finally going to alpha blocker or a beta blocker as a last step. Resistant hypertension, we all know 3 drugs in maximally tolerable dosages not controlled for more than 3 months is resistant. But MRAs remains a cornerstone of therapy for resistant. Then comes central alpha agonists like clonidine or alpha blockers, peripheral alpha blockers and beta blockers. And then in worst cases, you can have minoxidil as a combination. Refractory hypertension is failure to achieve the blood pressure with more than 5 drugs in 3 visits over 6 months. That is called refractory. But the basic difference in refractory and resistant respond to mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists. They are volume dependent, refractory, are sympathetic dependent, and respond to renal denervation. Renal denervation, last slide, can do all this, inhibits renin release, enhances renal sodium excretion, etc., etc. My question is this something that drugs cannot do? Of course, drug can do that. And that is why in this Denner-STN trial, it required 1,500 patients, referred patients, to make 106 eligible for the trial. Can you beat that? So it is important to choose your patient correctly when you're screening for renal denervation. So take home message is, know your patient well, embrace the guidelines, know your target for that patient, and tell this to your patient in bold, clear terms. This is where you should be. Explain the risk of uncontrolled BP every visit. An SMS will do. I only send an SMS. Your BP is 10 millimeter higher. Your risk of stroke is 18% higher. Your risk of heart attack is 10% higher. That's it. He goes with, reads that message, gets freaked out and says, control my BP very well. Use HBPM very freely and ABPM in select cases. Believe that masked hypertension does exist. There are some clinicians who believe there's nothing like masked hypertension. Know your drugs and SPCs and know the chronobiology of hypertension. And then you'll be able to control a large proportion of patients in this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. As usual, Pandey has done an exemplary coverage of the problem of hypertension, which may turn out to be resistant to hypertension, resistant to treatment, or difficult to control. He beautifully described the importance of home blood pressure monitoring and ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. He stressed where these two are important. And regarding the management, he stressed on the physician's role in management, in talking to the patient, impressing upon the patient, and telling them how dangerous it is to have hypertension and how beneficial it is to treat it. And his physician-related factors, one point, which often are neglected. The ignorance of the physician on many aspects could be one of the reasons why it's difficult to control. And let me see whether how the chat box is. I don't think there are any chat box questions that has come so far.
Okay.
No chat box question has come so far. And one day you may have to wait for any chat box questions to come. And I think I will take up the topic on cognitive disorders in relation to systemic hypertension, how hypertension, without your knowledge, and others becoming aware of it, produces brain changes. A new concept has come of late, and Ravi is the ideal person to talk on it. Dr. Ravi Kasliwal, please.
Thank you very much, sir. I must thank Dr. Pandey. He absolutely, what I thought, he has done that to the topic which we thought. So the problem of cognitive impairment, actually, I may not even speak about it, is because of uncontrolled hypertension. But let me see. Is this so? So hypertension is very common, with 40% of those over 25 having high blood pressure, representing approximately 1.4 billion people worldwide. So the problem is huge. And I can put it the other way around. Heart disease is the #1 killer, and high blood pressure is the single largest risk factor. But here we are talking of something beyond high blood pressure. Just look at India. 33% urban Indians are hypertensives, 25% rural Indians are hypertensives, 21% Indian men, 22% Indian women. Huge burden of hypertension in our country. 25% rural, 42% urban Indians are aware of their hypertensive status, but only 25% of rural and 38% of urban Indians are being treated, of which only 1/10 to 1/5 actually are treated to guideline levels. And if you look at the strokes and coronary artery disease, huge, 57% and 24%, as already pointed out. All heart attacks, all strokes, huge burden. But between these two things, between a stroke and there is something called cognitive impairment. So on this World Hypertension Day, this month is the World Hypertension Day, they've said very clearly, measure your blood pressure, control it, and live longer. And this is exactly from where I took the cue that we are not looking at hypertension in its entirety, but we are leaving certain points out. Let us say, what is cognition? Very simply, from memory, which is the easiest to pick up, that my father is now 65 years, he forgets things, to language, to judgment, to problem solving, knowledge, perception. This is what cognition is. And the few common signs of cognitive impairment, which we should also know when patients are coming to us: memory loss, frequently asking the same question, not recognizing familiar places. As Dr. Pandey said, we are not spending enough time with the patients. Otherwise, we will be able to pick up those who have got mild, moderate, or severe cognitive impairment, or those patients of ours who are getting antihypertensive therapy. Let us look at normal aging. Everyone experiences slight cognitive changes during age. Okay, that's fine. But there are three distinct phases: preclinical, moderate MCI, as we call it, moderate cognitive impairment, and then frank dementia, which may be Alzheimer's or which can be vascular. So on one axis, you have cognitive decline. On the other axis, you have the number of years. And this is a BMJ article, not very far back, 5 years ago. And you can see mild, moderate, moderately severe, and severe. This is the way cognition goes. Are we aware of it? Do you think we can help our patients? And I'll tell you the reason I'm worried about, I will come to that. But we should be able to pick up our patients when they have shown the mild cognitive changes. MCI is where we should be able to change the patients and talk to them about the value of controlling blood pressure, the value of physical exercise. I'll come to that. Are there ways by which we can examine them? Yes. Mini mental state examination is the commonly used one. Montreal Cognitive Assessment, mini COG test, all these are there. I'm not an expert in any one of them, but definitely I take the help of our coordinators who seem to be well versed in that. Now, if you look at cognitive disorders, just look at lifestyle factors. You have patients, as Dr. Pandey has already said, are being treated for hypertension. But those who are physically inactive, those who are obese, those who use alcohol abuse or cigarette smoking, all these patients have far more chances. You may get their blood pressures down, but they have far more chances of getting the number one thing, which is on top of this panel, atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis in the heart, atherosclerosis in the brain, atherosclerosis in the brain arteries. These are important things. To add to all that, we now have a growing burden of AFib. Atrial fibrillation will again cause us problems. So hypertension, if it is properly controlled, we will delay the process of atherosclerosis. And each time the patient comes, we have to talk to them about physical inactivity and about obesity. There is a sense in India that I'm retired now. So I can sit at home, I can increase weight, I can sleep in the afternoon, I can have sleep apnea. I don't care. But these are the very patients who will have steep cognitive decline. That is a fact. That is what we as cardiologists, we must understand this, and this is where we can come into the picture. Alcohol abuse, again, they say, oh no, we just take 2 pegs. Hey, what are the measure? I mean, if the person is taking 120 ml of alcohol per day, you can imagine how many neurons he's hurting. So the harmful effects of hypertension on cognitive function is not a new phenomenon. It was identified in 1960s when a study on psychomotor speed of air traffic, ATC, and pilots demonstrated reduced performance. So it's almost 40 years ago, somebody did think that your brain cells can be damaged. Since then, many studies have proven that hypertension is associated with worse cognitive decline, steeper than expected because of age. And this is what I'm very concerned about, midlife versus late life. And I'll come to that many of our patients, according to a study in Indian Heart Journal, 25% of our patients are actually midlife. So if we don't start controlling their blood pressures at that level and saying, no, this is all right, you're a young guy, you'll be fine, he is going to get cognitive disorder because you're giving him much more time. It's just like treating hypertension, treating LDL cholesterol. You will get your patient will reap the full benefits if he starts early. Not many people are saying that. I mean, so elevated blood pressure, 160 millimeters of mercury in the 4th or 5th decade, I will even take it down to 3rd decade, you will have steeper 10-year cognitive decline. This has been said by National Heart, NHLBI studies, and also by the ERIC cohort. Now, the ERIC cohort said that subjects to the diagnosis of hypertension defined as 160 or diastolic as 90 had lower scores on test of processing speed and word frequency. 160, 90 is huge. We have to go just above 130, 85. That's hypertension. And the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey showed that having hypertension or more than 140 or more than 90 diastolic at age 70 was associated with worse performance on the test for global cognition. My dear colleagues, we have many years, we have been looking at the data given from the West. It is not applicable to us. It is applicable only in the fact that it does cause cognitive disorders, but you have to start in our own country at age 40 to be able to stop the patients, because people are living longer, medical things are much better, and they will get cognitive disorders much earlier. The CARDIA study, coronary artery disease risk development in adults, here in this particular slide, we're not talking of CAD, we're saying that systolic blood pressure over 25 years of age from young adulthood to midlife was associated with a steeper curve for dementia. And that's what I'm interested in. That we all treat younger patients, we all treat obese executives, we all treat people who are smokers, and we get their CT angios done, we get their calcium scores done, we try to treat but we never tell them that, gentlemen and ladies, you are going to get cognitive disorders if you continue in this way for any length of time. Framingham study, everybody quotes that increments of 10 millimeters or more in stroke-free individuals in midlife associated with worse outcomes on composite global cognitive scores. So I think as cardiologists managing these patients, we will have to spend just those 10-15 minutes more. As Dr. Pandey and Dr. Vijayaraghavan pointed out, physician inertia is a big thing in uncontrolled hypertension, in resistant hypertension, in refractory hypertension. And whatever else they may do, they will certainly cause cognition abnormalities. And you look at it, the blue shows how the blood pressure is going up, the red shows how the cognition is coming down. I mean, this is unbelievable. If a person, after doing so much work, retires but gets cognitive disorder, what is he going to enjoy? What he has, reap the fun of what he has done for his entire life. And you can say, no hypertension, controlled hypertension, uncontrolled hypertension, and you can see how cognition is caused by hypertension. The factors associated with cognitive decline, very clearly, duration of hypertension. The more coronary artery disease you will get, duration of LDL cholesterol levels. It is not cholesterol levels that matter, it's also the LDL years that matter. Similarly here. Similarly here, we have not bothered about the trajectory of BP over time. Earlier onset of hypertension in adolescence and young adulthood, midlife hypertension, low pulse pressure gives you so much information. Simple test as pulse wave velocity gives you so much information, and ABPM gives you so much information. We can save hundreds of patients from tragedy. Look at this. This gentleman is a non-dipper. The one thing we always say, non-dippers will have more coronary disease, but they will also have more cognitive disorders. And this gentleman may also be a patient with obstructive sleep apnea. So you have picked up not only one disease, you've picked up two diseases where you can help this person not only get the blood pressures under control, cognition to be delayed, and also you have asked your person dealing with this thing that they take care of his obstructive sleep apnea if it exists. Simple test, pulse wave velocity, we do it routinely. And I tell you, this central aortic pressure and the stiffening of the arch of aorta and the ascending aorta, the pressure here speaks to the brain cells. Do not forget that. It speaks to the brain cells, and this is where cognition all takes place. So we knew it, but we didn't want to do it. So you see the median effect, memory, general intelligence, memory, processing speed, all these things will change if we have uncontrolled hypertension. We are not talking here of resistant hypertension. We're just talking of uncontrolled hypertension. What is the pathophysiology of this thing? Because of its precarious blood supply, let me come straight to the point, it is the white matter of the brain which is vulnerable. And see on this screen here, on your left side, stiffened arteries, remodeled arteries, hypertrophy, atherosclerosis. When we are so keen to look after atherosclerosis of the heart arteries, why are we not going a little higher and also looking after the arteries of the brain? The medicines are the same, the statins are the same, it is just our thinking. We should also go down and look at the peripheral arterial system. Then we have really looked from head to toe, whereas the beauty is that you don't really have to change too many medications. So this is physician inertia. Similarly, there are three disorders through which hypertension or vascular disease bring cognitive decline. Stroke, we all know that. Many times when patients come with bleeding from the nose and uncontrolled hypertension, we say, yeah, you're lucky, you could have had a bleed in the brain. But we should not laugh it off. This is serious matter. Stroke, small vessel disease, this is a stroke. MCA territory, very, very common. Hypertension induces atherosclerosis of the major extracranial and intracranial arteries. Tell me, what does it take to do a carotid Doppler? To see if there are plaques sitting there, to see carotid intermedial thickness. Nothing much. Secondly, and that's something which always interests me, is the endothelium. When we wrote our first paper on endothelial dysfunction, people actually scoffed at our back that, what are they talking about? But FMD has become important. Of course, FMD doesn't apply here, but here we are talking of endothelial dysfunction of the brain arteries. It is the same thing. They also cause atherosclerosis. There also you get stiffening, and you also get hyper, and because of the intermedial thickness, you get less blood supply. The point is, all these things are actually preventable. Not all, but a large percentage at least are they're preventable. So hypertension induces profound alterations of critical regulatory mechanisms of the cerebral circulation. Similarly, it does to the heart. Similarly, it does to the periphery. And we have three different specialists to look at it. But we as cardiologists are at the center. We have the wherewithal of telling our colleagues that, look, this gentleman is going to go into cognitive disorder. Then hypertension increases the deposition of beta amyloid and might aggravate cerebrovascular dysfunction induced by alpha B. So all these are connected. Endothelial dysfunction of the arteries of the brain will also cause, and brain dysfunction will also cause. It is the first step towards atherosclerosis of the brain arteries. Does treating hypertension reduce the risk of cognitive impairment? When should the antihypertensive therapy be initiated to minimize the risk of cognitive impairment? What class of antihypertensives are most effective? These are easy questions to answer. Does treating hypertension reduce the risk of cognitive decline? Definitely. The ALEC study definitely showed us. The EVA study group, Epidemiology of Vascular Aging, treated hypertension was associated with less cognitive decline compared with untreated hypertension. Rotterdam study, the Haas study, proved that duration of antihypertensive therapy appears important. So we should not have inertia. We will have to tell the patient that, look, it is not necessary. You may be a retired person. You may have hypertension. It does not matter that now you will start forgetting things. No, it is just about cognition. Keep your mind active. Keep your blood pressure under control. Physical exercise is the basis of all of this. Cigarette smoking, people should not even talk about it. It is a big no-no. Alcohol, if at all, should be in moderation. We all know these things. But what about young India? We are the youngest country in the world. Even our Prime Minister said we are the youngest country in the world. 25%, Indian Heart Study 2019 says 22.4. That means almost a fourth of our patients are between 20 to 44. Would you allow them to reach, and they will reach, you see. Today, with the advent of good medical therapy, many people will be reaching hundreds, 85, 95, without any problem in our country. Would you allow them to reach to this point with cognitive disorder, or will you allow them to be normal? That depends upon you. Hypertension must be targeted right from young adulthood and midlife to reduce risk of cognitive impairments later in life. So duration of hypertension, and I've already said so, is a strongly associated factor with the development of cognitive decline, and thus benefits of antihypertensive therapy is likely to be greatest. In a study that one of our DNBs did on MI below the age of 45, he found hypertension to be one of the risk factors. All antihypertensives have similar benefit in risk reduction when used in optimal regimen, but the best are beta blockers and ACE inhibitors and ARBs. Some people say that calcium channel blockers may not be that good. There are some contrasting studies, but definitely, even if they were, I don't know for sure, but even if they were, we have plenty of medication which we can start early on in life and they can continue without anything. One of the studies which has really impressed me is the PROGRESS study. This was unbelievable. And the more good came out of those patients who also took indapamide. So vascular risks are shared by heart and brain. Please understand that. Timely intervention on modifiable risk factors might diminish the prevalence of both cardiovascular and neurodegenerative diseases. Prevention covers measures which not only prevent the occurrence of disease, but also arrest the progression. If the patient already has it, you can arrest its progression and reduce its effects once established. So I would think management of hypertension is now essential in ensuring normal brain aging and thus longer preservation of intellectual capacity and autonomy. I think that is a very important thing. If we have controlled the blood pressures and the patient gets cognitive disorder, well, we haven't done so good for the patient. With these few words, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your kind attention. Dr. Raghavan, Professor Raghavan, Dr. Pandey, so much to learn from both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi Kasliwal. It was an absolutely illuminating talk on cognitive impairment and systemic hypertension and the lot of hypertension, the longer it is there, the more is the cognitive impairment. Early to detect, early to treat is the only way that you can prevent cognitive impairment. And Ravi has stressed the point that whatever you have in your heart, you have in tissues everywhere, including your brain. Never forget that. That's where the cognitive impairment comes. And the patient may not be aware of it. People around may be aware of it. That's the limitation of cognitive impairment. And cognitive tests are not done in the cardiology clinics. And hence, we may not be able to detect it unless you probe carefully for it. I still remember at the ESC in London, about 5 or 8 years back, Elizabeth Burns, the person who got the Nobel Prize for longevity and the length of telomeres, she's speaking on longevity. She said the secret of success in old age to remain useful to the society and to the family and to yourself is remain physically and mentally active. It is not only the physical activity, but the mental activity should also be maintained. It is the cognitive impairment that we talk about is being impaired by long-standing hypertension, and that's what should be prevented. I'm looking for questions. Chat box. There was one question I remember. I saw one for Pandey to answer about the timing of drugs, and the question came as whether you will be giving diuretic in the evening. Is it desirable or not?
Yeah, I think see the loop
Louder,
diuretics.
yeah.
The loop diuretics should not be given in the evening because obviously that will disturb your quality of sleep. But cheap diuretics, thiazide type diuretics can be definitely be given in the late evening, maybe 7:30, 8 o'clock in the night, because they don't have that much of diuretic effect in inverted commas. They may have more of vasodilatory effect, and they can be certainly given in the late evening.
Two people have asked this question of diuretic in the evening. The drugs that we use actually, you can comment on clothalidone also. This is something which could be given in the evening.
Yes.
Because the diuresis may come much later.
Yes.
Any study, Ravi, any question, any study from India in cognitive impairment in hypertension?
No.
That's the question.
But one very good study, which I didn't quote because of its extensive data, came from Jack just a few months back. This was a study based on MRI. Amazing study, followed up for 15 years. And they said MRI every 5 years, every 3 years. And they found those whose blood pressures were not controlled showed progressive decrease in the white matter of the brain. It was an amazing study. You know, what I feel, the reason why we thought we'll keep uncontrolled hypertension is that this is something which most cardiologists don't even bother about. That 150/90 is not good. And then he said, no, because you're sitting in my office, so it is 5 points higher. No, if it is anything above 135/80 in the person's home, he is damaging here, he's damaging here, and he's damaging the brain. So I think we have to come out of this inertia and say, look, you are retiring or you have a good age, you have all the resource, now you should be able to live well. That will be only when you control your blood pressure, your lipids, and your physical activity levels. I think that message must go from the Indian Academy loud and clear.
Very, very extremely important, important.
Yes.
Then the question, above 65 years, how to exclude Alzheimer's as a parameter in hypertension with cognitive impairment?
Yeah, you know, the dementia, broadly we can divide into Alzheimer's type and we can divide it into vascular type. But both these conditions will be heightened, the decline will be faster if the BP is uncontrolled. I'm saying Alzheimer's will take a different route. There are other reasons for it, but it will it will go, decline will be much higher if we do not control hypertension, don't control our LDL levels, don't tell them about physical activity. And of course, it may almost sound comical to tell an Alzheimer person to do exercise, but there are ways of it. People can help them walk. It's very important, sir. We'll have to spend and tell them very clearly. Or very, very good.
One more question. Any difference in literate versus illiterate as cognitive impairment in hypertension?
Yeah, Vijay, many people say that, see, lawyers have very little cognitive impairment. They're mentally working all the time and all. But truly, I haven't seen that difference. But
it depends on the doctor's perspective towards the individual.
Yes.
Very much on the doctor's perspective too. Again, I will quote Elizabeth Burns in remaining physically and mentally active. There, the individual is utilizing his ability to the utmost.
Yes.
That's where cognitive impairment becomes minimal and he becomes useful to the society, to the family, and to himself. Looking after oneself is one of the most important part of managing a patient or a long period of time.
Yeah.
For ABPM, how many readings should be high to up-titrate the medication for hypertension? Dr. Pandey?
Yeah. In ABPM, normally what we do is in the daytime, we take reading every half an hour. And in the sleep, we take usually around 45 minutes to 2 hours. So the total reading should be, out of whatever total reading you get, at least 80% or 90% of them should be readable, not with artifacts or anything like that. And out of the legible readings, if even 1/3 of them are above the control value, you need to up-titrate your therapy. So 1/3 is the cutoff across the board. NICE guidelines say 25%, and European Society of Hypertension say 30% of the readings, if they are above the value of 130/80 cutoff, then you need to up-titrate the therapy.
Not only we can update in the ABPM, looking at the trend of the blood pressure, you can even change the timing of the drugs also.
Absolutely. Yes.
From morning to evening, we can change the timing of the drugs also. And ABPM is an extremely useful investigation in patients for whom you feel there is a little difficulty in controlling their blood pressure. ABPM is a must. Extremely useful to the physician and to help the patient too.
Dr. Vijay, along with ABPM, the other thing which is also extremely important is to see arterial stiffness, the pulse wave velocity, the central aortic pressure, ankle brachial index. Then you take everything in totality. And as we all know, the central aorta talks to the brain, more to the heart.
Exactly.
And we can pick up, see, the whole meat is like a surgical strike. How early can we pick it up? Preemption is the key. Prediction and prevention will come much later. If we haven't preempted it, the person will be getting the problem first.
Exactly. What's important is early detection.
Yes, absolutely.
And proper prompt management.
Yep, absolutely.
I think most of the questions were over. Most of the good deliberation. People all applauded both the speakers in their deliberations. And I'm very happy to read those comments about both the speakers.
It is the chairperson who made the difference. the vice chairperson.
Chairperson is one of the.
And we are taking Dr. Pandey's word that from today, we will not have physician inertia. That is the bottom line. Thank you.
I think we had a very good review of detection, management of blood pressure, and about the management of identification of cognitive impairment and preventing it. This was the whole purpose of this particular session.
Yes.
And I think we have served that purpose very well. Detect it and treat it and how to properly treat it. Number one, physicians should be properly taught. And physicians should know that they have to spend a little extra time with a patient with systemic hypertension, because you are going to deal with somebody who may be a patient throughout his life, and your contribution is going to be so crucial in this medical management as well as in this community management. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Pandey and Ravi Festival. Now the days is yours.
Class fellow's father also. Okay. He's better. I will just make.
Hello.
Yep. I think my role is over. I think.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
for being here.
Thank. Nice meeting you, Dr. Pandey.
Thank you very much, sir. I need your blessings, sir.
That's
And
always
I need-
there.
Yes, sir.
Always
Thank you,
there.
sir. Thank you, sir.
Ravi, long time since we couldn't meet. None of us could meet because of the COVID, and let us wait for the future.
Yeah.
Then we could meet and talk.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for your
Thank
kind
you.
invitation to
Thank you, sir.
share this session.
Thank you, Dr. Kasliwal, for inviting me. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.